I have buried two people I loved. My wife Catherine, who left this world the way a light goes out in a storm. Sudden, total, without giving anyone time to reach for a candle. And my son Drew, who was lying in a mahogany casket at the National Cathedral, while a man I had never met rested his hand on my shoulder and promised to take care of everything my son had built. Except my son was not dead, and the man touching my shoulder was my blood. He just didn't know that I knew. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. You are going to love it here. My name is Franklin Whitmore. Most people called me Judge Whitmore for 30 years, and some of them meant it respectfully. I am 68 years old. I have a bad right knee, a Scotch collection that my late wife considered a personality flaw, and I consider a legacy, and what I can only describe as the single most practiced poker face in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I know this because I spent 3 decades on the federal bench listening to people lie to me with varying degrees of creativity, and I never once let them see what I thought until I was good and ready to tell them. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, in a house that Catherine and I bought the year Drew was born. It is a brick colonial on a quiet street with a maple tree in the front yard that Catherine planted herself, on her hands and knees in the October mud, while I stood on the porch holding a glass of iced tea and offering what I believed to be helpful commentary about the depth of the hole. She told me, without looking up, that if I said one more word about the hole, she would put me in one. That was Catherine. She said exactly what she meant, and she meant every single word, and the world made more sense when she was in it. She died 5 years ago. A Tuesday afternoon in November. She was driving back from the farmer's market on King Street with a bag of pears and a sourdough loaf she had been specifically excited about, and a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of Washington and Prince. The police officer who came to my door was young, maybe 26, and he had clearly rehearsed what he was going to say. And none of his rehearsal had prepared him for the way I opened the door already, knowing. I do not know how I knew. I suppose after 41 years of marriage, you develop a kind of signal, a frequency that simply goes silent. She left this world the way she lived in it, without hesitation, without half measures, without giving anybody the luxury of preparation. And she left behind a hole that no amount of scotch or Sunday morning routine or carefully maintained bird feeders could fill, though I have tried all three with what I consider admirable commitment. The maple tree she planted is still in the front yard. It is enormous now, the kind of tree that looks like it has always been there, like it was part of the original architecture. Every October it turns the color of fire. And every October I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee, and I watch it burn. And I think about Catherine on her knees in the mud, and I think about how the things people plant outlast everything, the arguments and the iced tea and the Tuesday afternoons. Everything except the love, which is, I have come to believe, the actual root system. But I am getting ahead of myself. This story is not about the people I have buried. Or rather, it is not only about them. It is about the one who climbed out. If you have made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. Let me tell you about my son. Let me tell you about Drew, Andrew Whitmore. Though God help anyone who called him Andrew to his face, was 39 years old, 6'1". He had his mother's eyes, which were the color of strong coffee, and my jaw, which Catherine always said was the only hard thing about me, which was not entirely a compliment. He was a cardiac surgeon, not the kind who simply performed surgery, but the kind who had, through some combination of his mother's relentless focus and my apparently genetic stubbornness, built something extraordinary. Whitmore Medical Group started as a 2-room practice in a rented office on Connecticut Avenue with a receptionist named Gloria, who was 63 years old and terrifying in the way that only women named Gloria who have worked in medicine for 4 decades can be. Drew was 29. He had just finished his fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and every major hospital system on the eastern seaboard had made him offers that would have been perfectly comfortable and perfectly safe and perfectly insufficient for a man who had watched his mother plant a tree in the rain and his father argue constitutional law in his kitchen on a Saturday morning. In 10 years, Whitmore Medical Group grew from that two-room office into a cardiac care network spanning 5 states along the eastern seaboard, managing assets and operations valued at over $420 million. He did it honestly. He did it with the same quiet, immovable determination that Catherine had carried in her spine and that I had apparently contributed through whatever chromosome is responsible for refusing to accept the word no from anyone, including reality. He called me every Sunday morning, 7:15, before the rest of the world had finished its first cup of coffee. He would call and we would talk for 45 minutes about nothing important, about the weather in Alexandria and whether the maple tree was turning yet, about a case I had read about in the paper that offended my sense of judicial procedure, about whether the new restaurant on King Street was worth the parking situation, about nothing, in other words, that mattered to anyone except us, which made it the most important 45 minutes of my week. 8 months ago, those calls changed. Not dramatically. Drew was too controlled for dramatic. He had spent his entire adult life holding human hearts in his hands, and that kind of work either teaches you to manage your exterior or it destroys you, and Drew had chosen the former with a consistency that I found both admirable and occasionally infuriating. But I knew my son the way you know a house you have lived in for decades. You do not need to see the crack in the foundation to know the foundation has shifted. You feel it. Something in the pressure. Something in the space between words where the easy silence used to live, replaced by a silence that was working harder than it should have to sound casual. The topic stayed the same. The weather, the maple tree, the parking on King Street. But the rhythm was off. Like a song played in the right key, but at the wrong tempo. He laughed a half beat too late. He asked about my knee in a way that felt like he was filling space rather than filling silence. And there is a difference between those two things that only people who love each other can detect. I did not press him. The Whitmores do not press. We wait. It is possibly our greatest strength, and almost certainly our most annoying quality. Catherine used to say that getting information out of me was like cross-examining a glacier, and I told her that was the nicest thing anyone had ever said about my professional demeanor. Then one Sunday he called at 5:45 in the morning instead of 7:15, and he said without preamble, "Pop, I need to come over. There is something I need you to see, and I need you to not be a judge about it." Not yet. I made coffee. I stood in the kitchen and waited. The maple tree was just beginning to turn. The first edges of amber at the tips, and the bird feeder Catherine had insisted on was full because I had filled it the night before, as I did every night, as I had done for 5 years, for reasons I had stopped examining, because examining them led to places I preferred to visit only briefly and on my own schedule. He drove the 40 minutes from the city in a silence I could feel through the phone even after we had hung up. There is a particular quality to the silence of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say so many times that every version sounds insufficient. I recognized it. I had heard it from defendants. I had heard it from attorneys. I had heard it from Catherine once. The night she told me her diagnosis was actually not a diagnosis at all, but a mistake at the lab, and her hands had been shaking. Not because she was relieved, but because she had already spent 3 days building a version of our life without her in it, and now had to take it apart. Drew arrived at 6:28. He parked in the driveway instead of on the street, which he never did because he knew I had opinions about oil spots on the concrete, and the fact that he parked there anyway told me something about the weight of whatever he was carrying. Some things are too heavy to walk an extra 30 feet with. Now, I should tell you something about my son that he would never tell you himself, because Drew believed that good work should be invisible, which is a philosophy that makes for an excellent surgeon and a terrible self-promoter. Every month, without fail, without publicity, without so much as a line on the company website, Drew performed 2 to 3 cardiac surgeries on children who could not afford them. Pro bono. Complete. From consultation through recovery. He had been doing this for 6 years. The hospital staff knew. His surgical team knew. His accountant knew. Because someone had to file the paperwork. And I knew. Because Gloria, the terrifying receptionist, had told me during a Thanksgiving dinner 4 years ago, in the kitchen, while Drew was in the other room arguing with his cousin Amanda about football, and Gloria had grabbed my arm with a grip that suggested she had spent her younger years doing something more physical than filing insurance claims, and she had said, "Your boy is a good man, Judge. A real good man. And he would be furious if he knew I told you, so you did not hear this from me." I did not hear it from her. I have never mentioned it to Drew. Some knowledge is best carried quietly. The same way some good is best done quietly, which is a lesson I suspect Drew learned not from me, but from watching Catherine plant that maple tree in the rain without telling a single person why. He came through the back door, which is the door family uses. He sat at the kitchen table, which is the table where every important conversation in this house has ever taken place. Catherine quizzed him on homework at that table. They argued about curfews at that table. I told him his mother was gone at that table, and he had sat in that exact chair and put his hands flat on the wood and breathed in a way that told me he was keeping something inside his chest through sheer structural force. He sat down. I placed a cup of coffee in front of him. He did not touch it. He opened a leather folder and set it between us with the careful, deliberate energy of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally decided to put it down. Not because the weight has changed, but because carrying it alone has become more dangerous than sharing it. "How long?" I asked, looking at the documents inside. 4 months of confirmed transfers, he said. Probably 6 of actual activity. I looked up at him. I did not need to say the name. He knew what I was going to ask. That is the thing about knowing someone for 39 years. The questions become unnecessary. Only the answers matter. "Victoria," I said. Not a question. He nodded. And there it was. The crack in the foundation I had felt for 8 months, given a name, given a shape, given the particular weight that only betrayal by someone you love can carry. I looked at my son across that kitchen table, in the house where he grew up, in the chair where his mother once sat, and I saw the thing he had been hiding beneath the changed calls and the wrong tempo laughter and the silences that worked too hard. Not anger. Not yet. Something that comes before anger. Something heavier and quieter. The specific grief of a man who has just discovered that a thing he believed in completely was built on a blueprint he was never shown. Now, I want to be precise about something. I did not dislike my daughter-in-law Victoria because she married my son. I disliked her because she was, from the moment I met her at Christmas dinner 7 years ago, the specific kind of person who performs competence rather than possesses it. You know the type. The woman who arrives with a gift for everyone, including the dog. And every single choice is precisely correct. The wine is the right vintage. The wrapping paper is the right weight. The card is handwritten in the right ink. And the cumulative effect is not warmth but architecture. A building designed to look like a home. She had a handshake that lasted exactly the right duration. She asked about my career with questions that demonstrated research but not curiosity, which is a distinction most people cannot detect, but which 30 years of listening to attorneys has made me incapable of missing. She complimented Catherine's cooking with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has already eaten and is performing hunger. And Catherine, who was dying quietly at that point, though none of us knew it, had squeezed my hand under the table in the particular way that meant I see it too. But this is not our conversation to have. Drew had loved her completely. Foolishly, in the way good men love women who have correctly identified their particular variety of blind spot. Drew's blind spot was competence. He respected it above almost everything, because he had built his life on it, and Victoria had arrived wearing it like a tailored coat. They had been married 7 years, no children. which Victoria had always framed as timing, and which I had quietly filed under strategy. The documents in the folder told a story that numbers always tell more honestly than people. 4 months of confirmed wire transfers routed through a shell company incorporated in Delaware, with secondary routing through a trust structure in South Dakota. The amounts were precise, calibrated just below the reporting thresholds that would trigger automatic federal review, which told me immediately that whoever designed the architecture knew exactly where the tripwires were. But it was the last page that changed the temperature in the room. A detailed accounting of the Whitmore Foundation's Pediatric Surgery Fund. The fund Drew had built quietly over 6 years to pay for children's heart operations. $312,000, redirected through the same Delaware corridor. I set that page down on the table with more care than it required, because the alternative was setting it down with the force it deserved, and I did not want to frighten my son with what was moving through me at that moment. There are many varieties of anger. The kind that comes from being stolen from is sharp and manageable. The kind that comes from watching someone steal from children you have personally held still while their hearts were being repaired is something else entirely. Something that sits below anger. In the basement of whatever structure contains a person's capacity for controlled response. The Foundation Fund, I said. Yes, Drew said. The Children's Fund. Yes, Pop. I removed my reading glasses. I set them on the table. I looked at my son. Who is the other name on these transfers? Drew pulled a second set of documents from the folder. A profile. Financial records. Corporate filings. A photograph. Printed on standard paper, but clear enough. Julian Cross, Drew said. 37. Financial consultant, based out of New York. Specializes in private wealth, restructuring for high net worth medical practices. I looked at the photograph. A man in his mid-30s with the kind of aggressively symmetrical face that belonged on the cover of a magazine about things you cannot afford. Dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes that held the camera with the specific confidence of someone who has audited every room he has ever walked into and decided he deserved a bigger one. He approached Victoria 18 months ago, Drew continued. Professional basis initially. Portfolio optimization. Then, it became something else. He did not elaborate on what the something else was. He did not need to. The documents told that story too. In the language of shared hotel reservations and a jointly held account in the Cayman Islands, opened 4 months before the first Delaware transfer. I studied the photograph of Julian Cross for a long moment. There was something about his face that I could not immediately place. Not recognition exactly. Something more peripheral than that. A familiarity that lived in the angles rather than the features. The kind of almost knowing that sits at the edge of perception and refuses to come into focus. I attributed it to the generic quality of his handsomeness. Men who look like that often look like someone you have seen before, because they look like every man who has ever looked like that. I set the photograph down. How did you find this? I asked. A discrepancy in the quarterly audit. Small. Almost invisible. The kind of error that only exists because someone was careful enough to be careful about everything, except the one thing they assumed no one would check. He paused. I check everything, Pop. I know you do. I have been building the case for 4 months. Quietly. Alone. The way Whitmores do things. The way Whitmores do things. I looked at my son across the table. Why didn't you come to me sooner? He met my eyes. And for just a moment, beneath the composure, beneath the surgeon's stillness, I saw my son, the real one, the boy who used to fall off his bicycle and pedal furiously around the corner before the tears came because he thought I could not see him from the porch, when in fact I could see him perfectly, and had made the deliberate decision to let him believe otherwise, because some lessons about strength require the privacy of a corner. Saying it out loud to you makes it a verdict, Pop, he said quietly. And I was not ready for the sentencing. That sentence broke something in me that I did not know could still be broken. Not because of what it said about Victoria, but because of what it said about my son's understanding of what I was to him. Not just a father, a judge, and he had spent 4 months building evidence because he knew, in the courtroom of our kitchen, my standards of proof were absolute. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. We sat like that for a while. The coffee grew cold. The light through the kitchen window shifted from early amber to full morning white, and the maple tree threw long shadows across the yard that shortened as we sat there, which is what time does when you are not paying attention to it. Then I said, "All right. So what is the plan?" And my son, my brilliant, infuriating, meticulous, magnificent son, smiled for the first time since he had walked through my door. "Pop," he said, "how do you feel about attending a funeral?" I looked at him. "Whose?" I said. "Mine. I want to describe to you the specific experience of helping your son plan his own death. It requires a peculiar kind of love, the kind that sits comfortably next to madness and borrows its coffee mug. It requires the ability to hear your only child say the words, 'I need to be dead by Thursday,' and respond not with the horror that any reasonable parent would feel, but with the calm, procedural clarity of a man who has spent 30 years evaluating the structural integrity of other people's worst ideas and has finally been asked to evaluate one from someone he actually cares about." "Explain," I said. Drew leaned back in his chair. The smile was still there, small and private. The smile of a man who has been thinking in a dark room for a long time and has finally found the light switch. "Julian will never incriminate himself in a controlled environment," he said. "Not in a meeting. Not on a recorded call. Not in any context where he has the faintest reason to believe he is being observed. The man is careful, Pop. Careful the way people are careful when they have done this before. So you need an uncontrolled environment. I need a controlled environment that he believes is uncontrolled. I need a space where Julian Cross feels so completely safe, so thoroughly convinced that he has already won, that his own confidence becomes the thing that convicts him. And a funeral accomplishes this. My funeral accomplishes this. Because the only place a man like Julian will ever drop his guard completely is standing over the body of the man he just defeated. He will not be able to resist it. He will want to perform. He will want Victoria to see him being powerful, and he will want you to see it too. Because men like Julian do not just want to win. They want the people closest to the loss to witness the winning." I sat with that for a moment. It was, I had to admit, tactically elegant. It was also, and I say this with the full weight of 30 years of judicial temperament, completely insane. "You are asking me to attend your funeral," I said, "to sit in the front pew and grieve convincingly while you are alive inside the casket." "Also yes." Drill. We looked at each other across the kitchen table, and I realized that this was the moment where a normal father would say absolutely not, where a reasonable person would insist on attorneys and restraining orders, and the proper channels that exist specifically for situations where your daughter-in-law is stealing from your grandchildren's heart surgery. Fun. And I realized simultaneously that I was not going to say any of those things, because the proper channels had not protected my son's marriage. The proper channels had not prevented $312,000 from being siphoned out of a fund that existed solely to keep children alive. And because Drew had not come to me for permission, he had come to me for partnership. There is a difference. It is the difference between asking your father if you can and asking your father if he will. "Who else?" I said. The smile widened slightly. He had known. Of course he had known. 3 people, he said. Rachel Nguyen, attorney, former federal prosecutor, now in private practice in Georgetown. She handled the whistleblower case for MedStar 3 years ago. I remember that case. She has been waiting her entire career for exactly this kind of situation. I spoke with her last Tuesday. She used the word delightful 3 times in 12 minutes, which I found both encouraging and mildly concerning. I could already picture her. The kind of attorney who alphabetizes her fury and files it under future use. Second, Drew continued, Dr. Lena Okafor, anesthesiologist. We did our residency together at Hopkins. She is possibly the most precise human being I have ever met. In a profession that selects for precision. She once recalibrated a dosage mid-surgery based on a 0.3% shift in blood oxygen that no one else in the room had noticed. And she agreed to this? She owed me a favor. What kind of favor? The kind that remains between the two people it is between. I recognized the boundary. I respected it. I also made a mental note to investigate it later, because I am a retired judge and old habits do not die. They simply move to a consulting basis. Third, Drew said. George Morrison. Morrison and Sons. Funeral home. I know George. His father handled your grandmother's arrangements. His grandfather handled mine. 4 generations, Pop. George accepted the situation with the specific composure of a man whose family has seen stranger requests across 120 years of service. Though when I asked him to name one stranger, he smiled and said he was bound by professional confidentiality, which I respected enormously. The plan had the architecture of something that had been built over weeks, not days. Every load-bearing wall was in place. Every sight line had been calculated. Drew walked me through the broad strokes with the same focus he brought to pre-surgical briefings. Clear, sequential, anticipating questions before I asked them. The funeral would be held at the National Cathedral. This detail stopped me. The cathedral, I said. Drew, your mother and I were married there. I know, Pop. The symmetry is not lost on me. It was not lost on me either. We sat with that for a moment. The cathedral where I had watched Catherine walk toward me in white, 41 years ago, with her shoulders back and her jaw set, and an expression that said she knew exactly what she was getting into and had decided I was worth the investment anyway. The same space where I would now sit and pretend that everything she and I had built together had come to its worst possible conclusion. The medical component, Drew said, and his voice shifted into the register I recognized from the occasions when he explained complex procedures to patients' families. Calm, thorough, designed to make the impossible sound merely improbable. Lena has identified a compound that will lower my vitals to levels consistent with cardiac death. Temporary. Controlled. Reversible. How reversible? Completely reversible. Lena has tested the protocol extensively. She will monitor everything remotely in real time. You are a cardiac surgeon, Drew. You are telling me you are going to temporarily stop your own heart. Slow it. Not stop it. There is a meaningful clinical distinction. There is a meaningful paternal distinction between my son being mostly dead and completely dead, and I would like to stay on the correct side of it. He almost smiled. You will, Pop. I promise. The coffin had 6 things inside it that a normal coffin does not. I am going to list them for you because the details matter, and because my son designed each one with the same surgical precision he brought to every operation he had ever performed, and I believe that precision deserves to be acknowledged. First, a concealed oxygen supply, miniaturized and silent, built into the base lining beneath a false panel that George Morrison had constructed with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested his family's 120 years in the funeral business had occasionally included requests that fell outside the standard catalog. Second, a body temperature regulator, because a casket that is closed for 6 hours will develop a thermal signature inconsistent with a body that is actually deceased, and Drew had thought about that, because Drew thought about everything, which was simultaneously his greatest quality, and the reason he had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 4 months. Third, a heart monitor, transmitting a continuous signal to Dr. Lena Okafor's phone. She would be positioned in the vestry, a small room off the north transept of the cathedral, close enough to respond in under 90 seconds if anything deviated from the protocol. Drew had calculated the 90 seconds himself. He had walked the route twice. 4th, 5th, and 6th were the microphones, not 1. 3. And this is where my son's plan crossed the line from merely audacious into something I can only describe as architecturally beautiful in its thoroughness. The first microphone was sewn into the satin lining of the casket, left side, approximately 3 inches from where Drew's head would rest. This was the primary capture device, positioned to record anything said by anyone leaning over the casket in the intimate proximity that funerals uniquely provide. The second was embedded in the central floral arrangement that would sit on the casket lid. Rachel Nguyen had selected the equipment personally, and Drew told me this with the particular tone of a man who has learned not to question Rachel Nguyen's procurement choices. The third was built into the guest book pedestal, angled to capture conversations in the area where people gather after signing their names, the specific zone where mourners tend to speak most freely because they believe themselves to be in a transitional space, neither fully public nor fully private, and therefore somehow exempt from the rules of both. Additionally, 2 cameras had been concealed in the large floral arrangements flanking the altar. They covered the front 6 rows and the area immediately surrounding the casket from complementary angles. Rachel calls it the constellation, Drew said. Full coverage. No dead zones. He paused. No pun intended. I was not going to comment, I said. You were absolutely going to comment. He was correct. I was absolutely going to comment. The strategy was built on a single psychological premise, and it was a premise I had seen validated in 30 years of watching human beings behave in courtrooms, which is that people who believe they have won become incapable of silence. Victory is a drug that makes the user want an audience, and a funeral, Drew explained, was the single most perfect environment in which to administer that drug, because it combines 3 things that no other social context provides simultaneously: emotional permission, physical proximity, and the absolute certainty that the one person who could hold you accountable is no longer capable of doing so. Julian will come to you, Pop, Drew said. Men like him always come to power, even grieving power, especially grieving power. He will not be able to help himself. He will want to perform. You know this man well, I said. I know men who think they have already won, Drew said. Same architecture, different facade. My job, my one singular critical job, was to sit in the front pew of the National Cathedral in the suit Catherine had bought me for her own funeral, which is exactly the kind of woman she was, and grieve convincingly. I was to be the grieving father, broken, quiet, dignified in the way that old men are dignified when the worst has happened, and there is nothing left to do except endure it publicly. I practiced in the mirror twice. I stood in my bathroom at 11 o'clock at night, and I looked at myself, and I attempted to produce the expression of a man whose only son is dead. And I decided almost immediately that I was overthinking it. I had survived 30 years of federal sentencing hearings in which I was required to maintain complete neutrality while listening to things that made me want to overturn my own bench. I had survived 2 terms as president of the Alexandria Homeowners Association, which is a crucible that no law school adequately prepares you for. I had survived one particularly brutal Thanksgiving, at which Catherine's college roommate brought her new husband, who had recently discovered cryptocurrency, and wanted to share his thoughts about the Federal Reserve with a sitting federal judge, at length, with charts he had printed from the internet. I could sit still and look devastated. I had range. 3 days before the funeral, the phone rang at 9 in the evening. Drew, everything is set, he said. Lena is ready. Rachel has the filings prepared. George has the casket finished. Good. Thank you for not trying to talk me out of this. I stood in my kitchen, looking out at the maple tree in the dark. You could not see the color at night. Only the shape. The massive, silent architecture of a thing Catherine had planted with her own hands that had outlived her by 5 years and would outlive me by 50. You did not come to me for permission, Drew. You came to me for partnership. I know the difference. Silence on the line. Then, quietly, 7:15 Sunday. After all this is over, 7:15 Sunday, I said. That is non-negotiable. Thursday came the way all inevitable things come. Slowly, and then all at once. I put on Catherine's suit. I straightened the tie in the mirror. I looked at myself. A 68-year-old man in a black suit that his dead wife had chosen with the same unerring taste she had applied to everything. including him, and I drove to the National Cathedral to bury my living son. The National Cathedral holds 3,000 people. On a Thursday morning in October, approximately 400 of them came to mourn a man who was breathing steadily 6 feet below their grief. I know this because I counted, not all 400 individually, but enough to know that the nave was full past the 10th row and the transepts had begun to fill, which meant that my son had been loved in the broad, genuine way that only happens when a person has spent a decade doing honest work in a world that does not always reward it. I arrived at 10:30. The service was scheduled for 11. I parked in the clergy lot because George Morrison had arranged it, and I walked through the south entrance, and the first thing that hit me was the light. October morning light through the cathedral's stained glass does something to a room that I do not have adequate architectural language for. It turns the stone into something alive. It makes the air itself feel composed, as though even the dust particles have agreed to behave with appropriate solemnity. The last time I had been in this building with this kind of attention to my breathing was 41 years ago, standing at the altar, watching Catherine walk toward me in white. She had her shoulders back and her chin level, and an expression that communicated, with the elegant efficiency of a closing argument, that she knew exactly what she was agreeing to and had decided the terms were acceptable. I had loved her from across 60 feet of cathedral aisle, with a force that I did not know I was capable of until that exact moment. And I mention this because, standing in the same building pretending that the life she and I had built was over in the worst possible way, required me to hold both of those things simultaneously, the memory of beginning and the performance of ending, and the distance between them was the distance across which my poker face had to stretch. I took my seat in the front pew at 10:45. The casket was already in position, centered before the altar, mahogany with brass appointments, closed. George Morrison had done beautiful work. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. From the inside, it was a command center the size of a twin bed. The mourners filed in. I watched them from my peripheral vision, with the practiced stillness of a man who has spent 3 decades observing courtroom galleries without appearing to observe anything at all. They came in waves. First, the colleagues, the doctors and administrators and hospital board members who wore their grief with professional composure and spoke to each other in the hushed, efficient tones of people who had lost someone from the organizational chart as well as from their lives. Then the clients, the patients and their families, some of whom I recognized from the photographs Drew kept in his office, the before and after portraits that lined the hallway outside his surgical suite, each one a heart that had been held and repaired and returned. Senator William Driscoll sat in the 4th row. Drew had saved his life 2 years ago. An emergency bypass performed at 37,000 feet on a flight from Washington to Chicago when the senator collapsed in first class, and Drew, who had been sitting in coach because he had booked late, had walked forward with a calm that the flight attendant later described in a newspaper interview as the most terrifying composure I have ever seen in a person. The senator had sent Drew a handwritten note afterward that said, simply, "I owe you everything. Please send me the bill." Drew had never sent a bill. He had, however, started voting. 3 nurses from the pro bono clinic sat together near the back. They cried more than anyone, more than the colleagues, more than the patients, more than the family members who had known Drew his entire life. They cried with the specific devastation of people who had witnessed firsthand what had been lost, not the surgeon, but the man who arrived every 3rd Tuesday at 6 in the morning to operate on children whose families had been told by every other hospital that the word affordable did not apply to their child's particular variety of dying. And then there was Lily. I need to stop here for a moment, because this is the part of the story that came closest to destroying the entire operation, and it had nothing to do with Julian Cross. Lily was 8 years old. She had dark, curly hair pulled back with a yellow ribbon, and she was wearing a dress that was slightly too big for her, in the way that children's formal clothes are always slightly too big, purchased with room to grow into, which is its own small act of optimism. She walked up the center aisle holding her mother's hand, and in her other hand she held a piece of paper. She stopped at the casket. Her mother tried gently to guide her back to their pew, But Lily had the particular determination of a child who has decided something and will not be moved by adult logic. She reached up, barely tall enough, and placed the piece of paper on the casket lid. It was a drawing. A red heart with a band-aid on it, drawn in crayon, with the words, "Thank you, Doctor," written beneath it in purple letters that leaned slightly to the right, the way children's letters do when their hands are still learning the shapes. I learned later, at the reception, the details I had not known. Drew had performed Lily's surgery 3 years ago. A congenital defect, operable but expensive, catastrophically expensive, the kind of expensive that destroys families who are already standing on the thinnest possible financial ground. Drew had done the surgery for free. He had also, without telling anyone except Gloria, arranged for the hospital to waive all associated costs, and he had quietly paid for Lily's follow-up care and her mother's lost wages during recovery out of his personal account for 3 years. 3 years. Every month. Without a word, that drawing. A red heart with a band-aid on it and the words "Thank you, Dr. Drew" in purple crayon came closer to breaking my cover than anything Julian Cross would ever say. The fake funeral did not break me. An 8-year-old girl with a crayon did. I held still. I breathed. I allowed the grief to be visible, because in that moment, it was not entirely performed. I refocused. I had a job to do, and sentiment, however genuine, was not part of the operational brief. Victoria sat 2 seats to my left in the front pew. She was dressed in the precise calibration of widow's black that communicates grief without surrendering. Elegance. Tasteful. Expensive. Cut in a way that suggested she had either purchased it specifically for this occasion or had maintained a wardrobe category labeled tragedy for exactly this kind of contingency. Both options were equally plausible with Victoria. She had cried at the right moments during the eulogy. Not too early, which would suggest anticipation. Not too late, which would suggest inattention. She had produced tears at the exact inflection point of the minister's remarks about Drew's commitment to healing, which required either genuine sorrow or a comprehensive understanding of liturgical rhythm. I knew which one my money was on. She gripped the arm of Amanda, Drew's cousin, with a pressure that looked involuntary, but was applied with the geometric consistency of someone who understood that grief, when performed correctly, requires a physical anchor. Amanda, who was 26 and believed the best of everyone with a sincerity that I found both endearing and diagnostically concerning, patted Victoria's hand and whispered something comforting. Victoria received the comfort with practiced grace. I will grudgingly admit she was a committed performer. 7 years of marriage to my son had been, in its own way, a sustained one-woman show, and this was her closing night, and she was not going to leave anything on the stage. Julian Cross sat in the 5th row. Dark suit, dark tie. The respectful expression of a man attending the funeral of someone he knew professionally but not intimately, a carefully manufactured distance that would satisfy casual observers while positioning him close enough to the family section to migrate forward when the crowd thinned. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his posture calibrated to communicate solemnity without personal investment. I had studied enough defendants to recognize the architecture. Julian Cross was not mourning. He was waiting. There is a posture that belongs to waiting. A particular distribution of weight that favors the balls of the feet. A readiness in the shoulders that has nothing to do with grief and everything to do with timing. He was waiting for the room to empty to the right number of people, for the emotional temperature to reach the right degree of vulnerability, for the moment when proximity to power would feel natural rather than intrusive. He caught my eye once during the service. Across the rows, across the flowers, across the mahogany casket containing my breathing son and 6 things that were going to end Julian Cross's career, he gave me the solemn, sympathetic nod of a man who wanted to be read as decent. I nodded back. And something stirred again, that peripheral familiarity I had noticed in his photograph. The angle of his jaw when he tilted his head, the way his eyes held mine a beat longer than sympathy required. Not studying me. Something else. something I still could not name, like a word on the tip of a language I had forgotten I once spoke. I thought, clearly and with a calm that surprised even me, enjoy the next hour. The service ended at 12:40. The receiving line formed with the organic, sorrowful geometry that receiving lines always form, a slow procession of hands and murmurs, and the particular physical vocabulary of communal grief. People pressed my hand and said the things people say. He was so young, he was so talented. You must be so proud. If there is anything we can do. The senator shook my hand with both of his and said nothing at all, which told me more about his character than every speech he had ever given on the Senate floor. I received every one of them with the dignity of a man whose son is definitely, absolutely, 100% dead in the box 6 feet away. I modulated my grief to the appropriate register for each interaction. Warmer for the nurses, more composed for the colleagues, properly shattered for the family friends who expected to see a broken old man and deserved to see one. 30 years on the bench had taught me that people need to see what they came to see. Denying them, that is its own kind of cruelty. The crowd thinned. The 400 became 40. Then 20. Then the inner circle, which at this point consisted of Victoria, her sister Patricia, who had flown in from Denver that morning, and carried the specific energy of a woman who processed all emotions at maximum volume, Amanda, who was still quietly crying, Uncle Harold, who had driven up from Richmond and smelled powerfully of menthol cigarettes in a way that suggested he had smoked 3 in the parking lot in rapid succession before entering the house of God, and Julian Cross. Julian Cross, who had no business being in the inner circle, who should have, by every social convention governing funeral attendance, departed with the colleagues and the acquaintances and the senator, but who had instead migrated forward through the thinning crowd with the confident inevitability of a man accustomed to occupying spaces he has not been invited into, positioning himself at the periphery of the family cluster with the natural ease of someone who has been doing precisely this, inserting himself into structures that do not belong to him for a very long time. I stood at the coffin. I placed my hand on the wood, on the smooth mahogany surface that separated me from my living, breathing, elaborately wired son. I talked to Drew the way a grieving father does. Quietly. Privately. The murmured nothing. Words that people say to caskets. Because the alternative is screaming. I could feel the room behind me. The quiet shuffle of people respecting the moment, giving me space. Patricia blowing her nose with theatrical commitment. Uncle Harold coughing in a way that might have been emotion or might have been menthol withdrawal. And then I felt him before I heard him. The specific displacement of air that precedes a tall man moving into a space with intention. The faint architecture of expensive cologne, arriving before the person wearing it. The warmth of a presence positioning itself at my shoulder with the practiced intimacy of someone who has decided that this moment belongs to him. Julian Cross leaned in close. And he spoke. Your son saved a lot of hearts, Frank. His voice carried the particular warmth of a man who has practiced sincerity until it became indistinguishable from the real thing, at least to anyone who had not spent 30 years professionally distinguishing the two. It was pitched deliberately low. Meant only for me. The intimate register of a man sharing a private kindness at a difficult moment. It is a shame he could not save his own. He paused. Let that land. Let me feel the weight of it. The poetic cruelty dressed as sympathy. The observation that was designed to sound like compassion and function as a blade. But do not worry. Tori and I will make sure the foundation continues. We will take very good care of his legacy. And then Julian Cross, standing in the National Cathedral at the funeral of the man he had stolen from, did something that I had not anticipated. He patted my shoulder, not gripped, not squeezed, patted, twice. The way you pat a dog, the way you pat a child who has lost a game and needs to be told that losing is acceptable. The gesture of a man who has placed himself so far above you in his private hierarchy that physical condescension has become reflexive. I kept my hand on the coffin. I kept my eyes forward. I breathed in. I breathed out. I counted to 3, slowly. Because the thing I wanted to do in that moment, which was to turn around and deliver a verdict that would have been admissible in no court on earth, was not part of the plan. The plan required silence. The plan required stillness. The plan required me to be the broken old man that Julian Cross believed he was comforting. And then I smiled. Not big. Not dramatic. A small, private, unhurried smile that I directed at the mahogany surface beneath my hand, where my son was lying in the dark, listening to every word, and where 6 hours of horizontal thinking time had apparently just been rendered insufficient to contain what was moving through him. Because from inside the casket, in the absolute silence of the National Cathedral, a sound emerged. Not a cough, not a voice. Something smaller than that, and infinitely more devastating. A beep. A single, clean, electronic beep. The unmistakable frequency of a cardiac monitor, announcing the presence of a heart that was beating faster than its protocol permitted. Then another beep. And another, steady, rhythmic. The vital signature of a man who was alive and who was, against every element of the plan and every instruction he had given himself over 6 hours of darkness, unable to remain still, while a man who had stolen from dying children patted his father on the shoulder like a housebroken animal. Drew had triggered it deliberately. I knew this the way I knew everything about my son. Not from evidence, but from the specific quality of the silence that followed. He had not coughed. He had not moved. He had done something more controlled than either of those things. He had activated the monitor's external speaker, a feature Lena had installed as a safety measure, and turned his own heartbeat into a sound that filled the cathedral the way a heartbeat fills a body. Quietly, inevitably. From the inside out, the beeping was not loud. In a room full of conversation, you might not have noticed it at all, but in the profound, weighted silence of the National Cathedral at 12:47 on a Thursday afternoon in October, with a dead man's father standing motionless at the casket and a thief's hand still resting on the old man's shoulder, that small electronic heartbeat was the loudest sound in the District of Columbia. Julian Cross stopped breathing. I felt it happen. The hand on my shoulder went rigid, the fingers curling slightly inward the way fingers do when the body they belong to has just received information that the brain has not yet authorized it to process. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stopped. The way a machine stops when the power supply is interrupted, every system going quiet simultaneously. I kept smiling. My small, private, unhurried smile. And then the lid moved. I want to paint this picture for you precisely, because the details matter, and because I have replayed this moment in my mind approximately 400 times since it happened. And it is still, without question, the single greatest thing I have ever personally witnessed. And I say that as a man who watched Catherine Whitmore walk toward him in this same building 41 years ago, which until this moment had held the top position unchallenged. The coffin lid did not burst open. Drew was too controlled for that. It rose slowly, deliberately, with the measured precision of a man who understood that the most devastating entrances are the ones that give the audience time to understand what they are seeing before they have to react to it. 1 inch, then 3, then 6. Then the lid was fully open, and my son was sitting up in his own casket in the National Cathedral at 12:47 on a Thursday afternoon in October, his dark suit immaculate. His color returning in real time, a flush of circulation moving across his face like dawn crossing a landscape. His eyes open, clear, focused, finding Julian Cross with the particular precision of a surgeon who has spent 6 hours horizontal, deciding exactly where to make the first incision. The beeping continued. Steady, present, alive. Julian Cross's hand was still on my shoulder. I could feel it trembling. "Hey, Pop," my son said. His voice was slightly hoarse, which is what happens when a person has been breathing recycled oxygen in a sealed environment for 6 hours. And it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life, and I include in that assessment every word Catherine ever spoke to me, which she would have understood and forgiven, because she would have felt exactly the same way. I looked at my son, upright, present, alive, in every measurable and immeasurable sense. The color was returning to his face in real time, circulation reasserting itself with the visible determination of a body remembering what it was built to do. His eyes were clear. His hands were steady. He was, even sitting in his own casket, in a cathedral full of people who had just been mourning him, unmistakably in control. "You were supposed to wait for the signal," I said. "He touched your shoulder, Pop." 4 words. That was all. He did not say he insulted me. He did not say he threatened the company, or he mentioned the foundation, or he revealed his plans. He said he touched your shoulder. Because my son, my brilliant, meticulous, strategically flawless son, had lain in a box for 6 hours, listening to every word Julian Cross said, and had maintained perfect discipline through every syllable of it, and the thing that broke that discipline was not the cruelty directed at him. It was the hand on his father. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I have been sitting with it for months, and it still moves through me like weather. I know what he said, Drew. So you understand. I understand you have no self-control. I was in a box, Pop. I am aware you were in a box. I watched them put you in it. He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved the way Catherine's used to when she was trying to maintain a position she knew she had already lost. The sounds that came out of that room. Patricia, Victoria's sister, screamed. A full, committed, boundary-expanding scream that began in the key of terror and modulated upward into a register that I suspect only dogs and certain marine mammals could fully appreciate. It was the kind of scream that a person produces when reality has violated its own terms of service, and Patricia produced it with the wholehearted commitment of a woman who had never in her life experienced an emotion at half volume. Uncle Harold, who had driven up from Richmond and who had been standing near the third pew with the quiet, menthol-scented dignity of a man who believed he had seen everything that the Lord intended him to see in this lifetime, said a word. It was a single word. It was a word that should not be said in a cathedral. And Uncle Harold knew this, because he immediately looked at the vaulted ceiling approximately 90 feet above him and mouthed what appeared to be an apology directed at the highest available authority. Then he sat down heavily in the nearest pew and placed both hands on his knees and breathed in a way that suggested he was renegotiating several foundational assumptions about how the world operated. Amanda, Drew's cousin, burst into tears. Not the quiet tears she had been maintaining throughout the service, but a different kind entirely. A sudden, explosive, full-body response that contained within it something I had not expected. Laughter. She was crying and laughing simultaneously, and the sound was extraordinary, the kind of sound that only happens when joy and shock collide at such velocity that the body cannot determine which response to prioritize and decides to deploy both. And Victoria. Victoria stood completely still. She did not scream like Patricia. She did not swear like Uncle Harold. She did not cry like Amanda. She stood in her precisely calibrated widow's black. And her face did something that faces only do when every performance a person has ever maintained collapses simultaneously, like watching 7 years of careful architecture come down in 4 seconds. Foundation, walls, roof, all of it, falling inward with the slow, inevitable totality of a controlled demolition. What was underneath was not grief. It was not love. It was not even surprise. It was the cold, mechanical calculation of a woman rapidly assessing her remaining options and arriving, in approximately 3 seconds, at the conclusion that there were none, which told you everything you needed to know about what the previous 7 years had actually been. Drew looked at her. For exactly 2 seconds. Just long enough to confirm what he already knew, what the folder on my kitchen table had told him, what 4 months of evidence had documented, What the absence of children and the presence of a man in the fifth row and the systematic dismantling of a fund built for dying children had made inescapably clear. Then he looked away. Calmly. Finally. The way you look away from something you have been staring at too long. Not with anger, but with the quiet recognition that the looking is finished. Dr. Lena Okafor materialized from the side door that connected to the vestry with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been standing by for precisely this moment and whose professional interest in the proceedings had not diminished her readiness by a single second. She offered Drew her arm. He accepted it, swung his legs over the side of the casket with a grace that I found medically impressive given that he had been horizontal and chemically subdued for 6 hours. And stood. He straightened his jacket. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked at me. "Pop," he said, with the tone of a man who has just returned from a long trip and is ready to discuss what happened while he was away. I looked at my son, standing upright, breathing, present, and I felt something move through me that I do not have adequate language for. Something that started somewhere behind my sternum and radiated outward with a warmth that made my bad right knee feel briefly, magnificently fine. Then he turned, and he walked toward Julian Cross. There is a specific species of arrogance that only flourishes in men who have never, not once in their entire lives, been the least powerful person in any room they have occupied. It grows in a particular soil. The soil of early success and unchallenged confidence, and the specific kind of handsomeness that causes people to agree with you before you have finished your sentence. Julian Cross was a botanical garden of it, but even a botanical garden can freeze. Drew walked toward him slowly. Not aggressively. Not with heat. Not with the theatrical menace that lesser men mistake for power. He walked with the measured, unhurried calm of a surgeon approaching an operating table. A man for whom the preparation has already been completed and the procedure is now simply a matter of execution. He stopped approximately 3 feet away. The distance, I noted with professional appreciation, that an experienced attorney maintains from a hostile witness, close enough to read every micro-expression, far enough to deny any claim of physical intimidation. The two men looked at each other. One standing, one rooted. One alive in ways that the room was still struggling to process. One dying in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. "Julian," Drew said, pleasantly. "The way you greet someone at a dinner party?" Julian said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, which is what mouths do when the brain sends a command to speak and the throat refuses to execute it. "You look like you have seen a ghost," Drew said. Still nothing. Julian's eyes were doing something that I recognized from the courtroom, the rapid lateral movement of a man running calculations he cannot solve, searching for the exit in a building whose architecture he suddenly does not understand. "That is all right," Drew said. "You do not have to say anything. You have already said everything that matters." He tilted his head slightly. A gesture I knew well. Catherine used to do it when she was about to deliver information that she wanted the recipient to have the full experience of receiving. "About 11 minutes ago," Drew said, into a microphone. The color left Julian Cross's face. Not gradually. The way color leaves a face when someone is embarrassed or caught off guard. Completely. Instantly. The way color leaves a landscape when a cloud passes over the sun. One moment he was a man with a complexion, and the next he was a man without one. "The satin lining," Drew said helpfully, in the tone of a surgeon explaining a procedure to a patient who has not yet grasped the scope of what is happening. "Left side. Approximately 3 inches from the pillow." Julian made a sound. Small. Involuntary. Not a word. "Also the floral arrangement on the casket lid. And the guest book pedestal." Drew paused. 3 microphones, Julian. And 2 cameras in the arrangements flanking the altar. Rachel calls it the constellation. She has excellent taste in surveillance equipment. He paused again. The way a surgeon pauses between the initial incision and the deep work. A breath of professional courtesy before the procedure becomes irreversible. And in attorneys. as if summoned by her name, which, knowing Rachel Newen, was not entirely out of the question. The side door of the cathedral opened, and Rachel walked in. Sharp blazer, the color of charcoal. Flat expression, the kind that conceals not absence of emotion but a surplus of it. Held under compression. A leather document case under one arm. And the energy, the specific, unmistakable, atmospherically detectable energy of a woman arriving exactly on time to a meeting she scheduled 3 weeks ago. She was followed by 2 other people, a man and a woman, both in dark coats, both with the specific posture and the specific quality of sustained, unhurried eye contact that announces a profession before any badge is shown. Federal agents do not rush. They do not need to. The architecture of their authority is built into the way they enter a room, the way they position themselves relative to exits, the way their eyes move in a pattern that is not scanning but mapping, identifying not where people are, but where they will try to go. They position themselves with the quiet geographical certainty of people who know exactly which exit matters and have already decided it does not. Rachel set her document case on the front pew and opened it with the efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments, which, given the company she was keeping, seemed thematically appropriate. "Julian Cross," she said, without looking up, in the tone of a woman reading the first line of a document she has spent 3 weeks perfecting. "These are federal wire fraud charges filed this morning in the Northern District of Virginia." She produced the documents with the practiced ease of a card dealer at a table where only one hand matters. "These," she continued, producing a second set, "are the civil asset freeze orders covering the Delaware entity, the South Dakota Trust, the 2 offshore accounts in the Caymans, and the brokerage account opened in January under your mother's maiden name." She looked up at Julian for the first time. Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, the way light shifts behind stained glass when the sun moves. "Which was creative," she said. "I will give you that. It did not work, but it was creative." Dr. Lena Okafor, still standing near Drew, glanced at Julian with brief clinical interest, the reflexive assessment of a medical professional observing a patient whose vital signs have become suddenly and dramatically noteworthy. I suspect she was calculating his heart rate from visual observation alone, which, knowing Lena, she was entirely capable of doing. "There is also," Rachel continued, and her voice shifted into the particular mild register of someone saving the best for last, the vocal equivalent of a dessert menu, a separate filing regarding the $312,000 redirected from the Whitmore Foundation Pediatric Surgery Fund. She closed the document case with a sound that was quiet and final, which crosses a threshold that makes this substantially less of a financial matter and substantially more of a moral one. "Your attorney will explain the federal sentencing implications. I suspect you will find them clarifying." The 2 agents had moved to positions that were not aggressive but were geometrically deliberate. They stood the way chess pieces stand after a decisive move, not threatening, simply occupying the squares that matter. Julian Cross looked at the documents. He looked at Rachel. He looked at the agents. He looked at Drew. And then he turned to Victoria. Julian turned to Victoria. It was a movement I had seen 1,000 times in courtrooms. The defendant, stripped of every defense, turns to the one person they believe still belongs to them. It is not love. It is not loyalty. It is gravity. A falling man reaches for the nearest wall. "Tori." His voice was raw, younger. The boardroom baritone had evaporated somewhere between Rachel's 3rd document and the 2nd federal agent's positioning near the south transept. What remained was the voice of a man who had rehearsed every possible outcome except this one. "You need to call Richard. Right now." Richard. I noted the name. Not a lawyer I recognized. Not a name from any of the filings Rachel had shown us. A private number. Then, a lifeline Julian had kept separate from the Delaware shell entity, the South Dakota Trust, the Cayman accounts. Everyone keeps one phone number that exists outside the architecture of their ambition. Julian's, was Richard. Victoria did not move for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is not long in ordinary life. In a cathedral where a dead man is sitting upright in his own casket and federal agents are standing at measured intervals, 3 seconds is a geological era. Then she reached into her black clutch. She pulled out her phone, and she dialed. But not Richard. Rachel, still at Drew's shoulder, leaned toward me. Her voice was barely above a whisper, the kind prosecutors use when they want the jury to lean in. She is calling her own attorney. Separate representation. A pause. She agreed to cooperation terms 4 days ago. 4 days. I let that number settle into my ribs, the way cold air settles into old houses. 4 days ago, I had been standing at the kitchen window, watching the maple tree shed its October leaves, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether the gutters needed cleaning before November. 4 days ago, my son had been lying in a hospital bed while Dr. Okafor calibrated the compound that would make him appear mostly dead. 4 days ago, Victoria had already decided which side of the line she would stand on when the architecture collapsed. Drew had known. Of course he had known. My son, who scheduled heart surgeries with the precision of a Swiss rail system, had not built this operation with a single point of failure. Victoria's cooperation was not an accident. It was a low dew-bearing wall. She has been keeping her own records for 7 months, Drew said quietly. Watching Victoria speak into her phone with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this call in her mirror. Longer than any of us knew. 7 months. That meant Victoria had begun documenting before Drew discovered the first transfer. Before the folder. Before the Sunday call at 5:45 in the morning. She had been building her own case while Julian built his confidence, and neither man had noticed, because neither man had thought to look at the woman standing between them as anything other than a supporting character in his own story. Drew turned to me then. Not to Julian. Not to Victoria. To me. Pop. There is one more thing. His jaw tightened the way it does when he is about to deliver a diagnosis that will change the shape of someone's remaining years. The pregnancy. She told me 5 months ago that she was carrying our child. It was the reason I did not act sooner. 5 months of hesitation. Purchased with a lie. He said it without bitterness. That was worse. Bitterness is hot. It moves. What Drew carried was something colder, something that had frozen into fact and become part of the permanent record. Victoria's pregnancy lie. Architecture designed to keep a good man still, while the foundation beneath him was being dismantled. One transfer at a time. Drew placed his hand on my arm. The Whitmore handshake. Brief. Heavy. Carrying more weight than the words we could not find. At 1:15, the agents moved. Julian was escorted toward the north entrance. His steps measured but diminished. The suit that had looked custom-tailored an hour ago now hung on him like a costume from a production that had closed without warning. His shoes clicked against the cathedral stone in a rhythm that reminded me of a metronome winding down. Drew spoke one final time, his voice carrying through the nave with the acoustics the National Cathedral was built to provide. It was not the money, Julian. Julian slowed. Did not stop, but slowed. It was something else. I hope you spend the next few years thinking about what you actually wanted. Because I do not believe. Even you know the answer. Julian's expression flickered. Something passed across his face that might have been recognition, or might have been the last reflex of a man who had spent his career making other people believe he understood things he did not. Then the agents guided him through the door, and the October light swallowed him whole. The cathedral settled into silence. The kind of silence that follows a verdict. Not peaceful. Not angry. Just complete. Uncle Harold, who had been sitting in the third row since the coffin opened, cleared his throat. Would someone, he said carefully, like to explain to me what in the name of the Almighty I just witnessed? Amanda, still holding a tissue she had not used since Task 9, looked at him with an expression that balanced affection and exhaustion in equal measure. It is a very long story, Uncle Harold. I have time, Harold said. I appear to have canceled my afternoon. Drew almost smiled. Almost. I stood in the center of the nave, my hand still resting on the mahogany casket that had held my living son, and I felt something I could not immediately name. It was beneath the satisfaction, beneath the relief, beneath the dark pride of a plan executed with surgical precision. It was cold, it was patient, and it was growing. I did not know what it was. Not yet. But I knew it was mine. And I knew it had been waiting for this moment longer than any of us. The days after a funeral are supposed to be quiet. People send flowers. Neighbors leave casseroles on the porch in ceramic dishes. They claim they do not need returned, but absolutely expect back within 2 weeks. The phone rings less. The house settles. Grief, if it is real, begins its slow and patient work of rearranging the furniture inside your chest. But our funeral had not been real. And the quiet that followed was not the quiet of mourning. It was the quiet of a detonation site. The blast had occurred. The debris had scattered. And now everyone involved was standing in the dust, checking themselves for injuries they had not yet felt. Drew moved back into his old bedroom on the second floor. Not permanently, not officially. He simply appeared on Friday morning with a single leather duffel bag and set it on the floor beside the bed he had slept in from age 6 to 18. He did not ask. I did not offer. It was a Whitmore arrangement, meaning it was negotiated entirely through silence and the strategic placement of fresh towels. Dr. Okafor called twice on Thursday to confirm Drew's vitals had fully stabilized. The compound she had administered was, as she described it, out of his system like a guest who knows when the party is over. His heart rate had normalized within 4 hours of the casket opening. His blood pressure returned to baseline by Friday morning. The only lingering effect was a mild headache that Drew treated with 2 aspirin and what he called aggressive hydration, which meant he drank 4 glasses of water and 1 glass of the scotch I keep in the cabinet above the refrigerator. Rachel Nguyen filed the remaining civil motions on Wednesday. The asset freeze was comprehensive. Julian's accounts, the Delaware entity, the South Dakota Trust, and both Cayman structures were locked under federal supervision. The brokerage account opened under his mother's maiden name, which Julian had apparently believed was invisible, had been flagged 6 weeks earlier by Rachel's forensic team. The total exposure, once Rachel's accountants finished their preliminary calculations, exceeded $11.3 million. The pediatric surgery fund diversion alone carried a potential sentence enhancement that Rachel described, with characteristic understatement, as meaningful. Julian was being held at the Alexandria Detention Center. His attorney, the mysterious Richard whose name Julian had called out in the cathedral, turned out to be Richard Calloway, a white-collar defense specialist from K Street who charged $900 an hour and had, according to Rachel, a perfect record of getting sentences reduced but never eliminated. Julian had not posted bail. Whether that was a strategic decision by Calloway or a reflection of the fact that Julian's accessible assets were now frozen was a question Rachel left unanswered, with a smile that answered it anyway. Victoria was staying at the Hay Adams, room 412. I know this because Rachel told me, and Rachel told me because Victoria had asked her to. That detail settled into my morning coffee like a stone dropped into still water. She wants to meet, Drew said on Friday afternoon. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the maple tree do what it does every October, which is perform a slow and magnificent act of surrender. The leaves were past their peak now. The reds had deepened into something closer to rust, and the yellows had begun their descent toward brown. With you? I asked. With both of us. I set my coffee down. The mug made a sound against the wooden armrest that was louder than it should have been. Why? Drew did not answer immediately. He was watching a single leaf detach from a high branch and begin its long, spiraling journey toward the lawn. The leaf took its time. Leaves always do. They have no appointments. She says she has something to show us. Something that changes the context of everything Julian did. He paused. Her word. Context. Context. In my 31 years on the federal bench, I learned that context is the word people use when they want to rearrange the moral furniture of a situation without admitting they are moving anything. A man who embezzles is a criminal. A man who embezzles to pay for his dying mother's treatment is a criminal with context. The law treats them identically. Juries do not. When? I asked. Tomorrow. Saturday. She suggested the lobby of the Hay Adams. Neutral ground. Nothing about the Hay Adams is neutral. It is the hotel where power goes to drink tea and pretend it is relaxing. Every conversation in that lobby carries the weight of proximity to the White House, which sits across Lafayette Square like a neighbor who never closes the curtains. But I understood Victoria's choice. She wanted formality without courtrooms, structure without judges. A stage, but one where she controlled the lighting. "What do you think she has?" I asked. Drew finally looked at me. His eyes, Catherine's eyes, carried something I had not seen before. Not anger, not suspicion. Something closer to preparation. The look a surgeon wears when he has reviewed the scans and knows exactly where the tumor sits, but has not yet decided on the angle of approach. I think she has the reason Julian targeted me specifically. Not the money. The reason beneath the money. The reason beneath the money. I turned that phrase over in my mind the way I used to turn over exhibits during deliberation. Every financial crime I had ever adjudicated had a surface motive and a subsurface motive. The surface was always money. The subsurface was always something older, something personal, something that smelled like history. "And you want to hear it," I said. It was not a question. I need to hear it. There is a difference. He was right. There was. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. Cold coffee is one of the privileges of age. You have already experienced enough warmth to know that temperature is not the point. "Saturday then," I said. Drew nodded. The maple leaf finally reached the ground. It landed without sound, the way most important things do. The lobby of the Hay Adams smells like old money and fresh lilies. It is the kind of place where the furniture has been reupholstered so many times that it has forgotten its original fabric, and where the staff moves with the quiet efficiency of people who have signed comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. I had been here exactly 4 times in my life. Twice for judicial conferences. Once for Catherine's birthday, the year she turned 50 and wanted, as she put it, one evening where nobody talks about sentencing guidelines. And now this, Saturday. 2:17 in the afternoon. Drew and I arrived together in his silver Audi. He had shaved. I had not. A small rebellion that I permitted myself because I was 68 years old and meeting the woman who had lied to my son about carrying his child. And I felt that a clean jaw was a courtesy she had not earned. Victoria was already seated when we entered. Corner table, east side of the lobby, positioned so that the afternoon light from the window fell behind her rather than on her face. A deliberate choice. Even now, even after the cathedral, even after Rachel's filings and Julian's arrest and the pregnancy lie, Victoria was staging her scenes. Some people cannot stop performing. It is not vanity. It is infrastructure. Remove the performance and the person beneath it has no idea how to stand. She wore a cream blouse and dark trousers. No jewelry, except a single gold band on her right hand that I had never seen before. Not her wedding ring. Something older. Something inherited. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was measured. Not cold. Not warm. Calibrated. The way a thermostat is calibrated. Set to a temperature designed to make everyone in the room functional without making anyone comfortable. Drew sat first. I followed. A waiter appeared. Took our order with the discretion of a man who had served diplomats arguing about borders, and vanished. "You said you have context," Drew said. No greeting. No small talk. The surgeon entering the operating room does not ask the patient about the weather. Victoria placed both hands on the table. Flat. Open. a gesture I had seen witnesses make when they were about to testify, and wanted the jury to believe they had nothing to hide. It works approximately 40% of the time. Julian Cross is not who you think he is, she said. He is a financial advisor who embezzled $11.3 million from my company. Drew replied. I think I know exactly who he is. You know what he did. You do not know why. She reached into a leather portfolio that sat beside her teacup. From it, she withdrew a single photograph. Not a printout. Not a digital image displayed on a phone. An actual photograph. The kind with a white border and a slight curl at the corners from decades of being stored in a place that was neither too careful nor too careless. The kind of photograph that has survived because someone decided it mattered but could not decide how much. She placed it on the table between us. I looked down. The photograph showed two people. A man and a woman, standing in front of a brick building with a green awning. The woman wore a yellow dress and had dark hair pulled back in a style that placed the image somewhere in the mid-1980s. She was smiling. The man beside her was also smiling, but differently. His smile was the smile of someone who has been surprised by happiness and does not yet trust it to stay. The man was me. I was perhaps 30 years old in the photograph. Thinner, fuller hair, wearing a navy blazer that I recognized because Catherine had thrown it away in 1992, claiming it made me look like a discount Kennedy. The woman beside me was not Catherine. Her name was Margaret Cross, Victoria said. The name landed in the center of my chest, like a judge's gavel striking the bench after a long deliberation. Margaret. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in 37 years. I had not allowed myself to think it in at least 20. Some names you bury so deep that you forget you buried them, and then one Saturday afternoon in a hotel lobby, a woman you barely trust places a photograph on a white tablecloth, and the earth gives back what you put into it. Margaret Cross, Victoria repeated, watching my face with the attention of someone reading a medical chart. Born 1958-9. Died 2003. Ovarian cancer. She was a librarian at Georgetown University for 22 years. I knew all of this. I knew it the way you know the layout of a house you lived in as a child. Not from thinking about it. From having walked through it so many times that the knowledge lives in your body rather than your mind. She had a son, Victoria said. Born November 14th, 1986. She raised him alone. She never told the father. Drew looked at me. I could feel his gaze the way you feel, a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. He was not asking a question. He was watching me receive an answer. Julian Cross, I said. My own voice sounded foreign. Older than I remembered it being when I had started speaking. Julian Cross, Victoria confirmed. Born Julian Whitmore Cross. Margaret gave him her surname. But his birth certificate, the original one filed in Arlington County, lists a father. She paused. It lists you, Frank. The lobby continued its quiet business around us. A couple near the fireplace laughed at something. The waiter delivered espresso to a man reading the Financial Times. The lilies in the central arrangement released their scent in slow, indifferent waves. The world did not pause. The world never pauses. It is one of its least considerate qualities. Drew's hand was on the table. Still. Not clenched. Not open. Somewhere between. The way a hand looks when the brain behind it is processing information that does not fit into any existing category. Julian is your son, Victoria said, looking directly at me. Which means the man who stole $11.3 million from Drew is Drew's brother. Drew's brother. The two words sat on the white tablecloth between us like a device that had been armed but had not yet detonated. I could feel the mechanism ticking. I could feel the heat of it against my palms, which were resting on my thighs beneath the table, where neither Drew nor Victoria could see that they had begun, for the first time in 31 years on the federal bench, to tremble. I had never told anyone about Margaret Cross. Not Catherine. Not Drew. Not the three colleagues who had attended my swearing-in ceremony and knew me well enough to finish my sentences. Margaret existed in a compartment of my life that predated everything I had become. I was 20 and 9. She was 20 and 7. We met at a Georgetown faculty reception where I was the youngest adjunct in the law school, and she was the new reference librarian who could find a Supreme Court citation faster than most of my students could spell jurisprudence. It lasted 11 months. It ended because I received the clerkship in Richmond that would eventually lead to the bench. And because Margaret told me, on a Tuesday evening in her apartment on P Street, that she did not want to be the woman who waited for a man whose ambition had a longer lease than his love. She was right. I knew she was right then, and I know she was right now. Some truths do not improve with age. They simply become more precisely themselves. But she had never told me about the child. He does not know, I said. My voice was functioning, which surprised me. The words arrived in the correct order, which surprised me more. Julian does not know I am his father. Victoria tilted her head. The gesture was small, almost clinical. He knows. He has known since he was 19. Margaret told him before she began treatment. She gave him the birth certificate, the photograph, and a letter she had written in 1987, the year after he was born. The letter explained why she chose not to tell you. A letter. Written in 1987. The year I married Catherine. The year Drew was born. Margaret had written a letter explaining her silence in the same year that my visible life began producing the family that would become everything I pointed to when people asked me what mattered. She had written her explanation while I was choosing nursery colors and learning how to hold a newborn without feeling like I might break him. What did the letter say? Drew asked. His voice was level, surgical. He was in the operating room now, cutting through tissue to reach the thing that needed to be seen. Victoria looked at Drew for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face satisfied something in her calculation. Because she continued. Margaret wrote that she did not tell Frank because she believed he would do the right thing. And she did not want the right thing. She wanted a choice made from desire, not obligation. She said that a man who returns because of a child will always look at that child and see the life he rearranged, and she would not do that to her son. The lobby sounds continued. The espresso machine behind the bar produced its small, mechanical exhale. A woman in a red coat crossed toward the elevator, her heels marking a rhythm on the marble floor that sounded like a clock that had decided to measure something other than time. Julian read that letter at 19, Victoria said, and he spent the next 16 years building a career in finance, specializing in medical sector portfolio management, positioning himself within proximity of Whitmore Medical Group. He did not want your money, Drew. He wanted your father's attention. She let the sentence breathe. Every transfer, every shell entity, every offshore account was designed to be discovered. Julian is not stupid. A man who builds a Delaware LLC and a South Dakota trust and 2 Cayman structures does not open a brokerage account under his mother's maiden name by accident. He left a trail. He left it because the trail led back to him, and he needed someone in the Whitmore family to follow it. I understood then. The understanding did not arrive like a revelation. It arrived like a diagnosis, slow, clinical, and carrying with it the knowledge that the condition had been present long before the symptoms appeared. Julian had not stolen from Drew. Julian had knocked on a door, loudly, repeatedly, with $11.3 million worth of noise, because the quieter methods, the ones that did not involve federal wire fraud statutes, had never worked. Margaret had chosen silence. Julian had chosen its opposite. Did you know all of this when you married Drew? I asked Victoria. She met my eyes. Whatever performance she had been maintaining since we sat down, she released it now. What remained was not warmth. It was not coldness. It was exhaustion. The face of a woman who had been carrying a secret that belonged to other people and had grown tired of its weight. I knew some of it. Julian told me 6 months into our affair. He told me who he was. He told me who you were to him. He told me that Margaret died, believing she had protected everyone, and that the protection had become its own kind of damage. She paused. I should have told Drew immediately. I did not. That failure is mine, and I will carry it. Drew had not moved. His coffee sat untouched. The cup had likely gone cold, but unlike me, Drew did not drink cold coffee as a philosophical statement. He simply had not remembered the cup existed. One question, Drew said. He was not looking at Victoria. He was looking at the photograph that still lay on the tablecloth, the image of his father at 30, smiling beside a woman in a yellow dress who had made a decision that produced a man who would one day steal from him in order to be seen. Did he love you? Drew asked. Julian, when he was with you. Setting aside the plan, setting aside the money and the birth certificate, and the 16 years of engineering, in the moments that were just the two of you. Did he love you? Victoria's composure, the last remaining wall of it, developed a single crack. It was visible in her left hand, which moved toward the gold band on her right, and turned at once, a rotation so small, it might have been involuntary. I do not know, she said. And I think that is the honest answer. The lilies released another wave of scent. The afternoon light shifted behind Victoria, lengthening her shadow across the tablecloth until it touched the edge of the photograph. Drew nodded once. Then he stood. Thank you, Victoria. For the context, he said the word without irony, without bitterness. He said it the way a surgeon says thank you to the nurse who hands him the instrument he needs for the most difficult part of the procedure. Functional, necessary, and carrying within it an acknowledgement that what had just been handed to him would leave a mark. Drew drove. I did not ask him to. He simply walked to the driver's side of the silver Audi, and I walked to the passenger side, and the arrangement was made without language, which is how Whitmores negotiate the things that matter most. The Hay Adams disappeared in the rearview mirror. Lafayette Square passed on our left. The White House sat behind its fence, lit by the October afternoon in a way that made it look like a painting of itself. Tourists stood along the sidewalk, taking photographs of a building that most of them would never enter, which is a reasonable metaphor for many things I was thinking about, but none I was ready to say aloud. Drew turned onto 14th Street, then onto the bridge. The Potomac moved beneath us, gray, green, and unhurried, the river that had witnessed every scandal this city had ever produced and had not once offered commentary. I envied it. Commentary was all I had, and none of it seemed adequate. We were 7 minutes into the drive before either of us spoke. 7 minutes of engine sound and bridge joints, and the soft percussion of tires crossing lane markers. 7 minutes during which my son, who had been medically dead 48 hours ago, drove with both hands on the wheel at precisely 10 and 2, obeying every posted speed limit, because Drew Whitmore does not break rules. He breaks the people who break rules, but the rules themselves he respects. How long? Drew said. I did not pretend to misunderstand the question. Pretending to misunderstand is a courtroom tactic, and we were not in a courtroom. We were in a car crossing the Potomac, and the truth had already been placed on a white tablecloth by a woman in a cream blouse, and there was nothing left to cross-examine. 11 months, I said. 1985 to 1986. Before your mother. Before everything. Before me. Yes, before you. The bridge ended. Virginia welcomed us with its familiar sprawl of trees and exits, and the particular quality of light that falls on the suburbs of power. Alexandria was 20 minutes away. 20 minutes is not enough time to explain a secret that has been kept for 37 years, but it was the time we had, and Whitmore's work with the time they are given. Did you love her? Drew asked. The same question he had asked Victoria about Julian, now redirected toward me with the precision of a scalpel turned in the surgeon's own hand. My son, I realized, had spent the last 4 minutes preparing this single incision. I cared for her, I said, deeply, but I did not love her the way I loved your mother. Margaret knew that. It is why she ended it. She had the clarity to recognize the difference between being cared for and being chosen, and she refused to accept the lesser version. Drew said nothing for 6 seconds. I counted them because counting is what I do when I cannot control anything else. She sounds like someone I would have respected, he said. You would have. She was the kind of person who made a room more intelligent simply by entering it. Your mother had that quality too. Different frequency. Same effect. We passed the exit for the Pentagon. The building sat to our right, enormous and indifferent. A structure designed to contain the machinery of decisions that affect millions. I had spent my career in a smaller building, making smaller decisions. But the weight was the same. Every decision that involves a human life carries the same mass, regardless of scale. A custody ruling weighs as much as a treaty. A birth certificate filed in Arlington County weighs as much as anything I ever signed from the bench. You should have known, Drew said. Not an accusation, an observation. The tone of a doctor reading a chart and noting a value that should have been flagged earlier. You should have known about Julian. Margaret should have told you. She made a choice. I understand her reasoning, even if I disagree with her conclusion. She believed that protecting Julian from obligation was more important than giving him access to his father. She was wrong, but she was wrong for reasons that came from love. And that is the most difficult kind of wrong to argue against. Drew turned onto the George Washington Parkway. The Potomac reappeared on our left, keeping pace with us like an old companion who had heard the conversation and chosen to walk alongside rather than comment. The trees along the parkway were deep into their October performance, reds and golds, and the occasional stubborn green of a tree that had not yet received the memo about the season changing. Julian spent 16 years trying to get your attention, Drew said. He could have written a letter. He could have knocked on the front door. He could have called on a Sunday morning at 7:15. The way I do. Instead, he stole $11.3 million from my company. That is not a reasonable approach to family reunion. No. It is not. But it worked. I looked at my son. He was watching the road, both hands on the wheel, jaw set in the Catherine line that meant he was processing something that would take days to fully metabolize. But there was something else in his expression. Something I had not expected. Not anger. Not betrayal. Recognition. The look of a man who has spent his entire life as an only child and has just been informed that the architecture of his identity contains a room he never knew existed. It worked. I agreed. We drove in silence for another 3 minutes. The parkway curved. The river curved with it. Alexandria appeared ahead, its church steeples and brick facades rising from the tree line, like a town that had been waiting for us to finish our conversation before allowing us to arrive. Sunday, Drew said as he turned onto our street. 7:15. Same as always. It was not a question. It was a restoration. Whatever had shifted between us in the lobby of the Hay Automatums, whatever fault lines had been revealed by a photograph and a birth certificate and a woman's careful disclosure, the Sunday call remained. The foundation held. The maple tree would still be there. The coffee would still be brewing. The conversation would still begin the way it always began, with small things that were not small at all. 7:15, I said. Drew parked in the driveway. The engine settled. The maple tree stood in the front yard, its October leaves catching the late afternoon light, each one burning with the kind of color that only appears when something is in the process of letting go. We sat in the car for a moment, not speaking, not moving, just two Whitmores, doing what Whitmores do, sitting with the weight, allowing it to find its place. Then Drew opened his door, and I opened mine. The Alexandria Detention Center smells like floor wax and regret. I have visited 17 federal facilities during my career, and they all share this particular olfactory signature, as though the General Services Administration placed a standing order for a cleaning product specifically designed to remind visitors that the world contains consequences. I went on Tuesday, 5 days after the funeral, 3 days after the Hay Adams. 1 day after the Sunday call with Drew, which lasted its customary 45 minutes and covered, among other things, the weather, the maple trees continued, October performance, and the fact that neither of us had slept more than 4 hours in the preceding 72. We did not discuss Julian. We did not discuss Margaret. We discussed the Washington Nationals pitching rotation, which was in disarray, and whether the front porch needed repainting before winter. These are the conversations that hold a family together, not the important ones. The ordinary ones. I arrived at the facility at 10:15. Signed the visitor log. Presented identification. Walked through 2 security checkpoints and 1 metal detector that beeped at the steel plate in my left knee, a souvenir from a replacement surgery 4 years ago that Drew had supervised from the observation gallery because he trusted the orthopedic surgeon, but not enough to leave the building. The visiting room was divided into cubicles separated by plexiglass. The chairs were bolted to the floor. The lighting was the fluorescent variety that makes everyone look like they have not slept in a week, which, in most cases here, was probably accurate. Julian was brought in at 10:23. He wore the standard-issue jumpsuit. His hair, which had been precisely styled at the funeral, was now simply hair. Without product, without intention. It fell across his forehead, in a way that made him look younger, closer to the age he must have been when Margaret showed him the birth certificate and the photograph and the letter that explained why his father was a stranger. He sat down, placed his hands on the metal counter, looked at me through the plexiglass, with eyes that I now recognized. They were my eyes, not Catherine's warm brown, not Margaret's dark hazel as I remembered it. Mine, the particular shade of gray-blue that my mother used to call storm coming, and that Catherine had called, more generously, interesting. "I was not sure you would come," Julian said. His voice through the intercom speaker had been stripped of its cathedral resonance. What remained was quieter, more careful. The voice of a man who had spent 5 days in a place where volume draws attention, and attention is rarely beneficial. "I was not sure either," I said. Honesty seemed appropriate. We had spent 39 years without it. The deficit was considerable. "Victoria told you." "She did." "Everything?" "The photograph. The birth certificate. The letter your mother wrote in 1987. I believe that qualifies as everything. Though in my experience, everything is a word people use when they mean everything they are willing to share." Something moved across Julian's face. Not a smile. Not quite. A recognition, perhaps, that the man on the other side of the plexiglass spoke in the same patterns he did. We were, after all, assembled from overlapping materials. "She did not tell you about the scholarships," Julian said. "What scholarships?" Julian looked down at his hands. They were still on the counter. Still flat. The same gesture Victoria had made at the Hay Adams, and I wondered briefly whether they had learned it from each other, or whether it was simply the universal posture of people preparing to be transparent. "Your mother, Margaret, could not afford Georgetown on a librarian's salary. Not for me. She applied for 7 scholarships. Received 3. The remaining gap was covered by an anonymous donor who contributed through the university's financial aid office every semester for 4 years. He looked up. The donor was Catherine Whitmore. The fluorescent light buzzed. A guard shifted his weight near the far door. Somewhere in the facility, a heavy door closed with the particular metallic sound that only institutional doors produce. "Your wife knew about me, Frank. Catherine. My Catherine. Who had thrown away my navy blazer in 1992. Who had planted the maple tree the spring after we moved to Alexandria. Who had called my eyes interesting and who had died on a Tuesday afternoon when a delivery truck ignored a red light on Route 7. Catherine had known. She found the photograph," Julian continued. "In a box in your study, 1991. She recognized Margaret from a Georgetown faculty directory. She made inquiries. Quiet ones, the kind that do not leave traces, unless someone knows exactly where to look. And when she found me, She did not confront you. She did not confront Margaret. She funded my education, anonymously, for 4 years. And she never said a word. I sat with this information the way I have sat with every piece of evidence that has ever changed the outcome of a deliberation. Quietly. Completely. Allowing it to displace the air in my lungs and replace it with something heavier. Catherine had known. For over a decade before her death, she had known about Margaret, about Julian, about the son I did not know I had. And her response had not been anger, had not been confrontation, had not been the slow, corrosive withdrawal that I had seen in dozens of marriages that crossed my courtroom on their way to dissolution. Her response had been tuition payments. Anonymous. Consistent. 4 years of checks written from an account I apparently never examined closely enough, directed toward a boy she had never met, because he was mine, and because Catherine Whitmore believed that a child should not pay for the failures of the adults who produced him. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. My voice was steady. I was not. Julian leaned forward. The plexiglass caught the fluorescent light between us, creating a faint reflection that superimposed his face onto mine. 2 faces. Same eyes. Different histories. 39 years of parallel lines that had finally intersected in the worst possible way and were now trying to determine whether intersection meant collision or convergence. "Because you came," he said. "And because she would have wanted you to know. The maple tree survived the winter. I say this because there was a storm in December. The kind that arrives without the courtesy of a proper forecast. And it took down the Henderson's oak across the street and half the power lines on our block. I stood at the kitchen window at 6 in the morning, holding a flashlight and a cup of coffee I had brewed on the gas burner because the electricity was out. And I watched the maple bend. It bent the way Catherine used to bend during the difficult years of my early career, with resistance that looked like flexibility but was, in fact, something much stronger. The maple held. It lost a branch, a significant one. On the lower left side, the one that had grown at an angle that always reminded me of an arm reaching for something it could not quite grasp. But the trunk held. The roots held. And when the storm passed, the tree was still standing, slightly altered, permanently incomplete, and entirely itself. Julian's trial concluded in February. Rachel Noen, operating now as a special consultant to the prosecution, presented a case that was, by any professional standard, comprehensive. The evidence from the constellation, the 3 microphones and 2 cameras, was ruled admissible after a suppression hearing that lasted 2 days and produced a 63-page opinion from Judge Watkins in the Eastern District of Virginia. Julian's attorney, Richard Calloway, earned his $900 an hour by negotiating a plea arrangement that reduced the charges from 7 counts to 3. Wire fraud, securities fraud, misappropriation of fiduciary funds. The pediatric surgery fund diversion was addressed in a separate civil proceeding. Julian received 52 months. He accepted the sentence without expression, which I recognized because I had delivered hundreds of sentences from the bench, and I knew the difference between a man who felt nothing and a man who felt everything, and had decided that the courtroom would not receive the privilege of witnessing it. Victoria's cooperation agreement held. She testified on 3 occasions. Her testimony was precise, organized, and delivered with the composure of a woman who had spent years rehearsing for stages and had finally found one where the performance served something other than herself. The court granted her immunity on the conspiracy charges. She moved to Portland in March. Drew signed the divorce papers on a Wednesday, at the kitchen table, using the pen Catherine had given me when I was confirmed to the bench. He did not explain why he chose that pen. I did not ask. Some choices are private ceremonies. Drew returned to Whitmore Medical Group full-time in January. The board, which had been informed of the situation through a carefully structured disclosure that Rachel supervised, voted unanimously to retain him. The pro bono pediatric program expanded. Drew hired 2 additional surgeons and secured funding that would cover operations for 3 years without requiring a single dollar from the general fund. He told me this on a Sunday morning, between discussing the Nationals' spring training prospects and whether the front porch paint had survived the December storm. It had not. We scheduled the repainting for April. Lily, the girl with the crayon heart, sent another drawing. This one arrived in February, in an envelope addressed to Dr. Drew at the clinic, with no return address, because 8-year-olds do not prioritize postal conventions. The drawing showed two figures, one tall and one small, standing beneath a tree that was covered in red hearts instead of leaves. Drew put it on the refrigerator, next to the photograph of Catherine at her 50th birthday dinner at the Hayat Adams. The two images shared the magnetic clip without commentary, which is how the best galleries operate. I visited Julian twice more before his transfer to the federal facility in Cumberland. The second visit was longer. We talked about Margaret, about Georgetown, about the 1987 letter, and the choices it contained. I told him about Catherine's scholarship payments, which he had already known, and about the navy blazer she threw away, which he had not. He almost smiled at that. Almost. The Whitmore almost smile, which I was now learning came from my side of the genetic architecture rather than Catherine's. The third visit, I brought a photograph of my own. Not the one Victoria had shown us. A different one, taken in 1985 at a faculty picnic at Georgetown, showing Margaret standing near a table of lemonade and sandwiches, laughing at something someone outside the frame had said. I had kept it in the bottom drawer of my study desk for 38 years, beneath a stack of old tax returns, which is where men of my generation store the things they cannot discard and cannot display. Julian held the photograph for a long time. He held it the way you hold something that has traveled a great distance to reach you, with both hands, carefully, as though the journey had made it fragile. She laughed like that, he said. All the time. I know, I said, and for the first time since I had met my second son, the plexiglass between us felt like what it was. Not a barrier, just glass, something you could see through. If the light was right, and both people on either side were willing to look. Sunday morning, 7:15. The phone rings. I am standing at the kitchen window, watching the maple tree push out its first spring leaves. They are small and pale and impossibly green. The color of things that have decided to begin again, despite having every reason not to. Hey, Pop. Hey, kid. How's the tree? Still standing. Lost a branch in December, but still standing. Sounds about right. We talk for 45 minutes. About small things. About the porch. About the Nationals. About whether April is too early to plant tomatoes, or exactly early enough. We do not discuss Julian's sentencing. We do not discuss Victoria's move to Portland. We do not discuss the fact that I now have two sons, one who calls me every Sunday, and one who I visit on the second Tuesday of every month in a building that smells like floor wax and regret. We discuss tomatoes, and that is enough. Because family is not the absence of fracture. Family is the decision to remain in the house after the storm has rearranged the rooms. It is the coffee that brews at 6. The call that comes at 7:15. The maple tree that bends and loses a branch and stands anyway. Slightly altered. Permanently incomplete. And entirely itself. My name is Frank Whitmore. I am 68 years old. I have two sons. And on Sunday mornings, the coffee is always ready. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of Frank's silence or the strength of Catherine's secret love, then you are the kind of person this channel was built for. Subscribe and press the bell icon. Because every week we bring you stories about families who break and rebuild. About the lies that protect and the truths that set free. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a comment telling me, what would you have done if you were Frank? I read every single one,